for me, one of the most intense things, therefore, in America, when we get into uh, areas of controversy and really dense blindness and just unspeakable cruelty, which America has a tendency to do with a very self righteous attitude, um, is I need to not enter the debate on the opinion page of the newspaper. you know, I need a I need to say, no, these are your ancestors speaking to you. And I need to say, okay, our society is modeled on these structures. So, what do these structures have to tell us? And how do we measure up next to our models? If our society is modeled in the moment in histories, and these histories, how do we, what does our history look like next to these histories? So, for me, it's very important to use Greek theater as a way to speak to contemporary America and to, as completely as possible, make the images contemporary and immediate about the things we're in a real moral crisis about. So, so when I was working at the American National Theater in Washington, D.C., in the second Reagan administration, which, if you think of that group of evil people, and this was a really terrifying moment in American history, and where everything that we've just been through with Mr. Trump and his friends was prepared and actually put in place then. And it was very intense being 25 years old um, in official Washington and being the court entertainment for the Reagan administration. And but again, I also understood the position of Aeschylus, or the position of Sophocles, is you're creating the court entertainment for the people who are making the decisions. And so again, it's not just diversion; it is responsibility. So at the Kennedy Center, we did Ajax in response to the Reagan administration's, bombings in Libya and in the Middle East, and and this assumption of the kind of madness of military power. And Ajax was a very useful um, image of the nightmare of any military solution and the absence of justice in any military solution, and meanwhile, the level of self inflicted violence that is inside military culture. And when military culture is your only recourse and your only impulse, um, it is self mutilating and suicidal. And the play speaks, really powerfully to those delusions of power and those jealousies and those specific nightmares of the more violence you commit, the more you're farther away from a solution. And in fact, you yourself um, have lost all honor. And so uh, the production was very shocking, and I have to say, one of the things that I did have done quite often is invited the playwright Robert Oletta, who died a couple years ago, to rewrite Aeschylus or Sophocles or Euripides, just because Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides always used contemporary immediate references, geographies, and so on, so that the audience were placed in a space they knew. There was no translation necessary. It was always very immediate and experiential. And so I need for an American audience to have those same sense of the immediacy of the landscape, the immediacy of what is swirling around you and what are we in the midst of right now. So I need that to feel immediate rather than telling the audience, well, in ancient Greece they did this and this and this. The play has to speak with that directness of time and place. So Bob rewriting the plays just lets them live in a specific zone of American violence because Bob's other plays are all about American violence. And he has an incredible rhetorical gift for how what the sound of American violence is, how it speaks, how it expresses itself. Um, in any case, the casting was intense. I mean, this was the '80s, so but but of course it's now what we normal. But at the time in the Reagan administration, it was shocking because I had all the role of the role of Ajax was performed by a deaf actor uh, who could only express himself. Well, was a is a spectacular actor. I mean, truly one of the great actors, but expressed himself entirely through gesture. And so it was the body speaking. And the intensity and the violence and the frustration and the tenderness and the loss and the hope and the hopelessness in the body uh, of this warrior. And as you probably know, the main image from the beginning of the play was he was in a giant tank, kind of like an aquarium, in the courtroom, in the manner that we seal off the dangerous area where the person on trial is. So he was in this plexiglass box, uh, up to his waist in blood. And so every time he would gesture, because he was soaking in this blood for about a half hour before the show began, and so every time he would gesture, his hands would shoot these sprays of blood against the glass. So you had this, just nightmare bloodbath, literally, and that he was inside of, and that and then finally when he steps out of this, because he's been soaking for an hour in this, with every step he takes this enormous blood on the floor. And the set by George Seepin was all made of aluminum and on a incline. And every step there'd be blood on the floor, and the blood would start flowing down in rivulets on the angled floor. So it was unbelievably visceral. And then all the generals and the chorus were all played by, and the angel were all played by African American actors, and Athena, which was a kind of shocking thing. The set was actually modeled on the loading dock of the Pentagon where they remove the garbage, and so which was across the Potomac River from the theater we were performing in. You could see it from the terrace of the theater. So this relationship to the Pentagon was very vivid and real, and official architecture, in the space of Greek tragedy, because that's also really, these are our institutions. And anyway, I will just say that the performance was very intense, just because all of the generals became the chorus, and they also had to voice for uh, Ajax. So you had the very people who were opposing him also having to speak for him. So it created this, complex double edge. And meanwhile, this was pre Colin Powell, or right now our current head of the Pentagon, who's a black man. But at this time it was unthinkable, even though most of the U.S. Army is made of people of color. At this time they were not generals, And so this was in the Reagan administration. That was a provocation to have all the generals be African American men, and but it also gave us a space into gospel singing, into traditional African American singing, which then gave the chorus a way to sing, and a way to sing that actually had a reality in American life, and also a sense of collective emotion, collective moral uh, 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 engagement and memory, and and a kind of sacred element to the performance. And then finally, of course, halfway through the play, which is incredible, the Ajax commits suicide, and at that moment, these all Pentagon doors opened, and water poured out down the down the stage, and gradually across the next 35-40 minutes washed away all the dried blood that had accumulated in this courtroom. And it became the beach where people found the body of Ajax. And we had all of the generals arrived by the unbelievably deafening helicopters, which would land right on top of the audience. The whole room was rigged for sound, and the sound of war, the sound of the Iraq War, the sound of war is so overwhelming, and Greek drama is about sound. So for us, the every Greek play that I do has a very elaborate soundscape, because it's all about again, this visceral thing you're feeling that you can't see but you feel it. So the sound of the water and the beach, the sound of those helicopters coming down with these generals stepping out of helicopters and walking over to the body, and as you know, in the history of the play, it's unusual that a character dies halfway through a play, the title character, but of course, he's not dead. He's lying there. He's stabbed himself. He's bleeding to death, but he's still conscious. And I think Sophocles really intends that he's hearing everything that is said about him after his death. He's hearing all of these people suddenly saying all these things, and the last thing he hears on earth is these hideous speeches from all of these people. And that's a very special question of, in Greek drama, how someone dies, and the actual anguish of dying, the anguish of death. And the anguish of death is also hearing what these people are saying and being unable to respond. And because Ajax was intent on responding to everything and everyone, and suddenly he can't say a thing, and he just has to listen to how he will be remembered, which is tragedy and pure anguish. And then you see the levels of corruption of all the other generals, and you say, well, wait a minute, who won? Excuse me, who won? Who's the winner here? And again, as you know, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides are very good at taking you to this point where you just say, no, wait a minute, the winners are who? And this kind of all or nothing, we're determined to win thing, which is, of course, America. And America cannot face the fact that it's lost every war since World War II. We are the losers in every one of these conflicts. Right up through, this last week, Afghanistan. And so this idea of people who think of themselves as winners and that you're winning all the time. And in fact, the loss is just immeasurable. And we're so far from anything that could feel like winning. We're just in the midst of loss and more loss and more loss and more pain and more humiliation. And the world looking at us and saying, what? So that was my play for Washington, D.C. Now, I'm sorry, I'm speaking at great length, but just to go into the detail of the Ajax, it's something special. Well, this is the great designer George Seepin, who, of course, is one of the great living artists. I mean, and this was our second collaboration together, and we were kids. George had just come to the U.S. from Russia. Uh, his family was in the that first group of Soviet Jews who were able to escape in the Jimmy Carter year, and so it was a very intense encounter. Uh, and George was at that point. Well, he still is fearless. He's just fearless, and he creates these images that are haunting, and again refuse to. Once you see them, you can't forget them, and at the same time, they don't reduce to a political comment. They have a large scale sense of spiritual devastation and renewal that are I think in the heart of the Greek plays, and renewal through devastation. I mean that you can't heal until you've reached the darkest and most desperate point, and then the healing is in this play letting go. Too late, but letting go, and that sense of the tides coming back in. Of course, as I told you, for me, to do that in the Kennedy Center in Washington with a set that was entirely made of metal, suddenly to have this presence of water pouring across the stage, and I do think of, seeing the image of the sea from the top of the mountains in Epidaurus, just this natural, the healing process of the natural world, that sense of new cycles, new growth, the tide coming back, and nature itself, um, creating a cycle of cleansing and healing and renewal, regeneration. No, no, I'm very obsessed with it. I refuse to show violence on stage. I'm showing the aftermath of violence, yes, but I'm not showing any violent act. I'm showing the violent act of the person who's just committed all this violence and the state they find themselves in, which is this bloodbath, and which is that their tracks now bleed. But I'm not showing one person being killed or anything. I'm showing the actual hell itself that the person who committed the killings is experiencing. And again, that violence is, as we've been saying, self mutilation. It's this self destructive thing, which Greek plays are very specific about. And it's the hell you place yourself in once you have passed certain limits and broken certain moral uh, rules. So, so no, there was not one image of violence in the whole piece. And again, what's beautiful is in sign language, you can take the language, and the language itself becomes so physically expressive. And so, but it was all language. Every gesture that Howie made was Sophocles translated into sign language. So the immediacy and the visceral power is there, but we're not restaging the massacre in any way. The massacre is something, again, we're remembering, and I think that's the state of also Americans. They have no idea that they committed these atrocities and can barely acknowledge what's going on in a refugee camp, what's going on right now in these prisons on the Texas border where all these kids are being kept. Americans can't, there's no image of that. That is exactly the issue. They can't look at it. So you have to describe it in a way that the image is internalized. And the image, because, we've learned to ignore the photos now. Well, okay, if we're going to talk about the photos, we might as well go to the Persians. You may recall, I mean, the Persians was made after a certain chapter in the first Gulf War of the retreat of the Iraqi army across the famous Highway of Death. Again, Howie Seago was back. Again, here, yes, this was the Highway of Death, where the retreating Iraqi army, there was 150 miles of road in an open desert with nothing on either side of it, and the Pentagon used the retreat of the Iraqi army to test all their new weapons because we had a lot of human beings we could just massacre freely out in this highway in the middle of nowhere. So we tested all of our new weapons. Like, because of course, right now, just killing people is not enough. We've really perfected, I mean, napalm was one of the first steps towards this, that someone won't just die, they'll die in unspeakable agony. It's not enough just to kill them. We're going to create something that is so specifically cruel. So the weapons we were testing, for example, sucked people's lungs out of their bodies while they died. I mean, just bizarre, horrifying weapons. And there was a journalist, Ken Jarecki, who photographed this Highway of Death, photographed the carnage, photographed the bodies, photographed these twisted, mutilated bodies on the Highway of Death. And it became a giant discussion in the Western press of these photographs were too disgusting and the public should not be allowed to see them. So every news organization voluntarily censored them. I think the Observer in London printed one photograph and then everyone condemned them because we couldn't bear to look at what we had done. And so to make that production, I called Ken Jarecki, who lives in Montana. And I said, I'd like to make a piece of theater that makes vivid and visceral what really happened and creates some sense of acknowledgement and accountability. And he said, great. And he sent me the pictures so I could use them in the production. And I got the pictures and there's no way we could use them. They were horrifying. I mean, to your point, Silke, it was everything that you deliberately, the Greeks didn't do that. It's not about a gross out. It's not about just making this, that you want to throw up. And it's not about, which is the opposite, for example, of Hollywood right now, the opposite of movie making right now, which is deliberately, and you've heard me say this before, but if Steven Spielberg were doing, Oedipus Rex as a movie, there would be a $350,000 budget for the exploding eyeball, and, and like the Greeks would be, no. But right now, all we want to do is see what does the exploding eyeball look like, which is not the question that Oedipus Rex is asking. Is it not what does an eyeball look like when you dig your fingernails into it? It's the question of why would somebody want to take out their own eyes? Always and we live in a period where the question is always what. But of course, for the Greeks, the question was always why. And all these plays are not about what, they're about why. And you're trying to get the fellow citizens to not just say, what was this and what was that? No. Why would anyone do these things? why would people do these things? So I couldn't use Ken's photographs. Um, what I did do was cast next to Howie an incredible artist, Martinez Miroto, who is one of the greatest Javanese dancers of his generation. And of course, in Java, dance is meditation, it's a spiritual act. And in Javanese tradition, it's dancers who are responsible for history. They're the ones who tell the histories, because it's understood in most cultures that history is not something fixed that you just write down, but history is always in motion. History never stops moving. And even history that's past, we're still reliving it. It has not solidified in any way, but it changes every day. The things that are past keep changing, keep morphing, keep meaning new things, keep not staying still. And that idea that history is always alive and moving is really important. And I think, again, also for the Greeks, why dance was one of the most, dance and poetry was how you represented history rather than, what are the facts? The facts are too small to describe what we're talking about and what we need to understand. The facts are minor compared to what is still in motion. What was set in motion that is still moving from these events? And so Miroto would, every night before the performance, Miroto was trained and raised in a context of mastery of spirit possession. And in Javanese ceremony, in special ceremonies, you invite spirits to enter your body. And then they speak through you. And then they leave. And it's very intense technology. And obviously, if it goes the wrong way, it's a catastrophe. Every night before each performance, Miroto would make an altar in his dressing room and open the book to one of Ken's photographs create a meditation and a prayer to the being whose remains are represented and invite that being to enter his body. And Miroto would ask permission to dance their story. So every night on stage, and the stage was empty except for 6 small rocks on a little pile. And Miroto just had a little mask. And otherwise he was in a simple military, jumpsuit. Olive green. And his mask was black. So you couldn't see his face, you just saw the mask and you saw his body move. And meanwhile, what we did was put a speaker underneath every third chair in the audience. So the sound is coming up from beneath the audience. And the sound is filling the space. Because again, the technology of the Greek amphitheater is so incredible. To me, we're living in a period where sound technology is spectacular. This is the area of greatest innovation in our lives now. It's the new sound technology. So the artist Bruce Odland, sound artist, said, how do we get this level of violence? Should we play sound effects, of tanks and bombs exploding? Bruce is a really great artist. And what Bruce did was he took a plastic tube, put a microphone in one end of it, and in New York City pointed the other end into street traffic. And you could hear the violence, metal on cement, that's inside every moment of life in New York City. Processed through this tube, which created this, you couldn't identify it anymore. So therefore, you just got the vibration of the violence itself. And it was simply terrifying. And that was pumped under every third chair in the auditorium. This eruption of sound, this visceral violence that was in fact the violence of an American city, the violence that's built into the texture of our lives that we never hear because we just take it for granted. But there it is every day in your life. So Miroto danced one person's experience while this sound overwhelmed the auditorium. And it was simply terrifying. And when we showed the Persians in America, somewhat in England, of course, at the Edinburgh Festival, but in America, more than half the audience left every night during the performance, and furious, and yelling back at the stage, and throwing their programs at the performers. And the theater here in Los Angeles, they were panicked. They said, Peter, you have to go on stage every night before the show and talk to the audience. They were panicked. And the audience was openly hated what the actors were doing and would attack the actors. And it took incredible courage for the actors to go out there every night, because this was a side of the Gulf War nobody wanted to acknowledge, of course. Um,
You
and let
said
me
it
just say
was,
one last thing about this
yeah.
this intense production, because again, there was nothing on stage but just five people. The great Nubian oud player Hamza Eldin played the oud, uh, and so we had this, traditional sacred protest music, as it were, but from the a deep kind of Mediterranean background, which is Greek culture, of course. Black Athena. This question of, for me, the African link of Greek culture. So to have a Nubian musician creating the music was very important. And meanwhile, the the role of the young king was played by uh, an amazing young actor coming right out of uh, Brooklyn gang territory. A young man so explosive, so shocking. And Bob Oletta rewrote the final part of the play, the final last speech of the terrifying last speech of the play, which lasts for, 20 minutes or 25 minutes, to say, okay, I'm the ruler that sacrificed the population. I sacrificed my own population for my pride of being able to defy the Greeks. And Bob Oletta shifted that to gang violence in American cities, where, the kids killing each other, and police killing the kids, and the kids killing the police. And in the mouth of this brilliant young actor, John Ortiz, he challenged the bourgeois audience that buys theater tickets, and he just said he would walk out into the audience in that last speech and be with them in the auditorium and say, "I am everything you're most frightened of. Here I am. And yes, all my friends are dead, but they died defying the United States of America. And nothing will ever change that." Which was very explosive. And brought this question of, everything the United States is always trying to destroy and kill, of anything that defies the United States, including your own children, including a generation of people in your own country. And again, the sense that, your giant ambition to silence these people and shut them up and make them stop is a self-inflicted wound. So again, the Persians was brought back home uh, to America, which again is the nature of Greek tragedies. It's not someone else's problem somewhere else. It's always bringing it back to us and where we live and how we live and what the choices are we've made. Anyway, that's a sketch of the Persians. It also was kind of beautiful because very few artists were responding against the Gulf War. Certainly American artists. It was unheard of. And I mean, because it was, you were for us or you were against us. It was that basic. It was that you don't dare question what we're doing. And so again, for audiences, it was really shocking, and it put the audiences in it. It was absolutely threatening to the audience. I wish I could say very different, but not completely. It was, I mean, the tension was visceral and very real. In Salzburg, it was recognized as an important work of theater, although it was very complex because at that point I was very inspired by what I read as a teenager uh, about the Schaubühne productions of Greek tragedy, and I was so overwhelmed by that, and so I had that on my mind. Meanwhile, the weirdest thing was Peter Stein was right there, and he refused to allow this to happen. He tried to prevent the performance from happening, and of course by that time Peter Stein was making the most elaborate sets in the world with the most famous actors and da 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 da, and it was weirdly official German theater that he grew up trying to fight, and then he began to make it. And so it was strange to see us in this mode with nothing on stage but these five performers, a couple rocks, and some sound. And that was a real challenge, is because Salzburg, of course, is a place of lux, a space of where you see your money on the stage perform for you. And it was so raw, it was so empty, it was so, there was no decor. There was just the rawness of human beings in painful situations, and with the this overwhelming sound quality, and and Miroto doing the spirit possession, which again I believe is really the closest thing to Greek theater, which is calling the spirits forward. And um, and I think we forget those technologies in Greek traditions. We forget what the priests and priestesses did in the ceremonies in Delphi, where you're calling the dead back to speak, where you're deliberately, that was technology for the Greeks. And again, just by concentrating on Greek theater, we're not concentrating on what is the technology in Delphi, what is the technology in Greek ceremony. The dead are present, and you're calling them back, and you're speaking with them, and you're in dialogue with them. So for me, that's very much the heart of the project of the Greek theater. The Children of Heracles is, again, you know, this crisis of immigration and this crisis of refugees in a country that is entirely made of refugees and immigrants is so weird right now in America that you still can't say the word immigration when most of the population, your ancestors immigrated here or were brought here in chains on a boat. So, what are we talking about? And yet, we still deported 60,000 people this last month. What? And Gestapo style, with a knock on the door in the middle of the night, and you take people away in handcuffs and put them in a prison in Texas and deport them to a country they've never been in and they don't speak the language. And that's going on today. How do you speak about that? So, again, the Euripides play, The Children of Heracles, became a really powerful uh, way to speak. And I just have to say, um, for me, this question that Greek theater isn't just the show was very, very, very important. And we did The Children of Heracles in 8 countries. And here, I have to say, I very fortunate to work in theaters that were very prominent, that were very visible, that had important boards of directors. And so the task was, Euripides wrote very beautifully for this question of the Athenians welcoming refugees to their sacred altar, which is their choice. Uh, and then the question is, well, if you have to now go to war and sacrifice your own children to protect the rights of these children, what do you say now? Which is a very intense question. Euripides had the children on stage that were whose future was, what we call now unaccompanied minors, whose future was hanging in the balance, and he had them sit there on stage, not speaking, which is still correct in an immigration proceeding at this moment. Is children are not speaking in the courtroom. Their fate is being discussed by adults, and they are not asked. They are sitting there silent. Already, Euripides creates this incredible theatrical power of a group of children sitting there looking at the audience and not speaking for the entire play. Um, I would, for me, that always in the question for me of every Greek play is who's this? Who are we? Who is the we in this picture? Um, because there was for me the stories of refugees were not getting out. I mean, for example, exactly that, what does it mean that we are separating parents from children on the Texas border these last 2 years? If we had actually heard from any parents or any kids who've lost their parents or parents who've lost their kids, that policy would have been stopped right away. But instead, we have a nice article in the New York Times reporting secondhand an observer on the other side of the fence. So for me, again, the theater part is you need to actually hear from the people this is happening to. What we realized was participation was really crucial. So in the 8 countries, we started going through the immigration system. And in Austria, starting with the Ministry of the Interior, and Oh my God, you would know Silka, the politician I'm thinking of. I can't think of his name right now, but anyway, one of these, lock them up and throw away the key and get them all out of here, right wing guys. But he couldn't resist the invitation from the Wiener Festwochen to appear because politicians love appearing. What we ended up doing is making around the play a series of dinners. So on stage every night, we had 25 kids coming from one of the detention centers who were kids who were going to be deported or their court case was pending. And we made arrangements in each country that we could have these kids on stage for the performance every night. So, first thing we did was feed them because they've been eating food in detention centers. And it was an incredible moment for them to come out and to suddenly be in the world and be with people and have some food and be there. Meanwhile, every night we had several people without papers who would speak to the audience beforehand. And the idea is to have just personal testimony of the situation of refugees and immigrants. And the idea was to use theater to create a space that didn't exist in real life. And every night we also invited immigration judges, the heads of immigration detention centers, immigration police, border guards, all the people involved in the apparatus. So every night you had a conversation with immigration judge and a refugee. Because in my country, for example, the judges have a list that they have to just check off. And so it doesn't matter what they think of this person. In fact, they already have to say no. Meanwhile, in Europe and in the United States right now, you have to tell one of three stories to be accepted. So it doesn't matter what happens. You have to learn how to tell the story they are going to accept. So in the most crucial 45 minutes in the lives of two people, they're both lying. How can we create a space of truth between them? So what does it mean for an immigration judge to be able to speak and say what feels right and what doesn't feel right? And what does it mean for a refugee to say what they really are looking for and why they're here? We had this conversation every night mediated by a journalist. And then we realized, oh, the chorus is a journalist. And so every night the chorus would be spoken by a well-known journalist. And before the performance began, we had a dinner every night where the Minister of the Interior in Vienna would have dinner with two African refugees living on the street of Vienna. And, those people would never have had dinner together, ever. It's just in a theater, in an art project, that they're sitting at the same table, breaking bread. And, it's awkward at first. And then, oh, they both have daughters. And gradually, there's a conversation. What I can say from that opening night in Vienna is those two Africans, 6 months later, got their identity papers because they had met the minister. And our project brought people together to speak that otherwise never spoke together and created a context where somebody could say something they couldn't say in their official job, but they could say in the space of an art project. And again, like the Greek plays, I would always ask the ministers, the the police, okay, when you wake up at 4 in the morning, what are you feeling? What are you thinking? The classic Sophocles thing. and and So the first hour of the play was the first hour that before the audience came was the dinner, where all these people had to meet as equals. The question is, can you create a structure where people who are unequal in the world can meet as equals? Yes, that's what art can do. And so we start with this dinner, then that goes in front of the public, and there's the continuation of the conversation. Then there's a break, and then we started the play. And the play was with actors, but with the actual kids sitting there looking at the audience. And when finally the Athenians say, okay, we will welcome these children as citizens, Euripides has it kind of implied. It's not exactly a stage direction, but it's amazing. Is these kids leave the stage and go through the audience because they're now part of Vienna. and and I asked them to stop every couple of rows and shake the hands of someone in the audience and say, thank you for letting me into your country. This was shocking in every place. Some people embraced them, shook their hand. Other people said, don't touch me. And you got the entire range of reaction. The what I did do was, of course, then a child has to be sacrificed in that play. And so the child sacrifice was really, I did in a very simple way of the actress lying down on plastic, because that's what bodies are wrapped in. And then we poured blood on her and created a ritual, and then wrapped her up in plastic and carried this plastic with blood in it around the auditorium as a formal sacrifice of a child, which is in the play. And yes, Greek plays don't show violence, but in fact, in this case, there is a formal ritual where a child is sacrificed. And that was just shocking, particularly after all these kids had just come and touched you and said thank you. And then you see the other side of the story is the sacrifice of children. And of course, as always, it drives me crazy, the old guard of classical scholars saying, oh, Ajax is unfinished. The Children of Herakles is unfinished. Every play that has a strange structure, this is unfinished, it's a fragment. Well, of course it's not a fragment. What's unfinished and a fragment is our society. But the play is complete. And you want to just say, the play leaves you in this unfinished place, because that's actually where we are. And that is the point, and everybody's looking for this lovely formal shape. And in fact, Euripides and Sophocles knew perfectly well that exactly the place where it's broken off is where we are. Anyway, just to say, what was interesting was in this case, I used an existing University of Chicago David Green translation published in the 50s, because the language of the 50s sounded like the US government. It was just incredible. So we couldn't rewrite that. It was like it was this perfect 50s governmental language that it was so cold and so harsh, and that was actually beautiful. Anyway, just to say, meanwhile, what was going on across the street or in the basement, in every country it was a little different, was during the performance, refugees were cooking for the audience. And then when the play is over, the audience goes to this place across the street or downstairs in the lobby or wherever, and there are tables and there's food. And refugees have been cooking food for the audience all night long. And we have one more dinner. And the kids who you couldn't speak on stage are at every table. So you end up having dinner with one of the kids who was on the stage and who's in a detention center now. And you can ask them. You can find out who they are. They're actual people. They're not numbers. They're not a picture in the newspaper. They're real people. And that was a really powerful experience, is at the end of the night to finally meet those kids. And you're ready to meet them. And it's not like, you don't dare say something to them at the bus stop. It's finally, you're in a place where you can speak to them. And again, we're breaking bread, which is the most basic human gesture of equality and sharing. So the every night the production had all of these things going on in very intense ways, and in every country it was inflected very differently depending on the immigration situation in the country. So in Spain they said, we don't have refugees, there's no problem here. Which is fantastic. you know uh, in France we did it at Bobigny in Paris, which was incredible and has incredible connections to the French press. And the fact that we involved journalists meant that there were 3 pages in Libération, and in Le Monde they profiled every child in the newspaper. And suddenly there were special editions, special sections of the paper that were telling people stories. So for me, those kind of interventions, the Queen agreed to participate in Holland. And so suddenly we were on the front page of all these newspapers of the Queen and these refugee kids. It just, every place it had its own dynamic. Homeland Security had just been created in the United States. And so we had the first early phase of Homeland Security represented every night in the performance. And so the audience was really close to, their own history that was being made right now. And meeting the people who are making decisions and hearing what is behind what this person is going through and imagining and experiencing and what the pressures are going on. And meanwhile, the experience of the refugees. In the case of Paris and also Boston, Cambridge, United States, many of the refugees didn't dare appear. So they were in a hidden room in the basement. Going back to our sound issues, they were in a hidden room in the basement, speaking remotely. So their voice was pumped into the auditorium. But they themselves, Nicolas Sarkozy was, the nightmare prime minister in France, and arranged in Bobigny to have identity checks at the subway stop leading to the theater, and had immigration police around the theater. So they had to have, many of the refugees were literally broadcast on speakers through the auditorium from the basement, from a hidden place in the basement. I'll never forget, this Afghan woman in Paris just said, please understand, we don't want your money. We do want your freedom. Just messages that had not been delivered. And I have to say, in Paris, it was only possible. We were getting people in and out of Sangatte, the famous refugee camp. And that was only possible because Ariane Manouchkine, who had totally devoted herself to this topic, and we were able to call her and say, Ariane, could you help us get inside? And she did. It was amazing. And her generosity really made it happen there. And in every country, we were in 8 countries. Every country there was a different way you had to get into the structures. You had to, that gradually governmental people agreed to participate. Gradually, different people in the press agreed to participate. It was negotiations all the way around. What was the conditions under which the kids could appear? All of that was very, very elaborately negotiated in every city. But again, for me, the theater is a working structure of a model, a test case of what would it be like if these people could talk? What would it be like if these people shared space? What would it be like if we were together? And and so the Children of Heracles was that kind of project. And again, it's a play that ends so brutally with a dictator laughing in the dark, who's been arrested but says I'll be back and I'm going to win and all that stuff. You just get that even in this moment of idealism, there's always going to be somebody who wants to take this down and wants to really shut everything down again, and they'll be back. I mean, Euripides won't just let you say, oh, you feel good about yourself now for these 10 minutes? Okay. Guess what? The fight continues tomorrow morning because these people will be back. The other image, of course, of the Children of Heracles, well, there's so many, but just to pick another image of the Children of Heracles that speaks so powerfully at the moment is for most immigrants and for most refugees, but also for most kids of the working class. Their dads are the strongest people in the world. And what it means, somebody who walks 2,000 miles from Tehran to show up at a European country, excuse me. I mean, it is heroic. And you see these people who do heroic things to get out of their country. Anybody who can get out of the Congo, anybody who can get out of all these places and arrive in Europe, it's heroic if you've made it there. And then for the kids to watch their dad, the most heroic and courageous person, be treated as nothing, which is the Children of Heracles. You watch your father die as a slave, and he's the strongest man in the world, and he's a slave. That's a very real image all over the world right now, is that people of unbelievable strength, unbelievable courage, unbelievable commitment, unbelievable determination arrive here and are treated as slaves. And their life is worthless to us. So those images that Euripides is using are so intense. And of course the international politics of it, of the neighboring countries say, okay, if you do this, all of that pressure from the countries around that we know so well. It's called Schengen. I mean, it's very, Euripides has laid it out. It's shockingly clear. The other thing I would just say, again, music and the sacred. We invited a great Kazakh um, sacred singer who comes from the mythical shaman tradition. Sang these incredible shaman epic songs with the owl feathers on her hat, calling the spirits, and she presided over the Children of Heracles, so that the sacred element was also present. Because again, we keep thinking of theater from our materialist society as human interest, but not with the sacred presence and what places human beings in a much bigger context and deals with larger questions of fate and karma. Well, again, I mean, opera is the inheritance of the Greek theater. I mean, it's in the big theater across from City Hall. It's in the big building that's part of the other government buildings. Opera exists in that state, and the audience are the decision makers, and and so on. So it's very close, and opera does deal with mythic material, of course, and And but also our politics are all mythic. Everything in your life is mythic. Everything you who you imagine you are as a people is mythic. What are the myths that you're living with that you choose to defend or choose to contradict? They're all myths. And I mean that in the both the positive and negative sense of the term. Is recognize in your life where the myths are. And those myths are inspiring or those myths are depressing. But they're myths and they're what govern society. And what is on the front page of every newspaper is a series of myths. And we say good or bad depends on how it compares with our own personal mythology. So the actual structures and process of Greek tragedy are not changed in any way. They're foundational for our whole civilization. And, I've been, this last year in America, things have been very intense, of course, with the COVID. And in my department at UCLA, world arts and cultures, I teach classes as social action and as moral action. But in COVID, three senior professors retired. And suddenly the head of the department said, "Could you cover some classes for us?" And they said, "Well, we have this class called Myth and Ritual." So I taught Myth and Ritual this year. Uh, but of course, for me, it was very important that every week, indigenous artists came, people for whom these truths were how they grew up and they operate in these cosmologies. And this is not primitive peoples, it's actually what it means to be alive. And that mythology is all about our collective destinies in whatever way you group yourself, in whatever size community, whether it's your family, whether it's your nation, whether it's your continent, whether it's right now in COVID and in the climate emergency, the human race. And ritual is the way we have any connection to our brothers and sisters, our parents, our grandparents, the people across the street. Ritual is the only way we're connected as human beings. And the only way we're connected to the natural world is through ritual. And so myth and ritual are the very heart of what we think we're doing on Earth is shaped by myth and ritual. So it's absolutely formational and potent. And we have to speak to that. And we have to speak from that. So that's why I keep turning to the Greek material in every one of these crises when you feel you have to address your fellow citizens and make a space for everybody to come together and go through some ritual that breaks bread, that like the Odeon, that we're breaking bread together, and at the same time there's sacred music, and we're experiencing what young people are going through. And we're reflecting in the dark by listening very carefully to people we would otherwise not hear ever.